Hello and welcome to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. The western United States is ablaze with intense and widespread fires. What role does climate change, forest management, overpopulation, and resource management play in the increasingly devastated fire seasons worldwide? Doug Becker explores.
I'm Doug Becker. In the last few weeks, the western part of the United States has experienced one of the worst wildfire seasons in history. Not coincidentally, some areas have also recorded the highest temperatures since researchers began recording them. What is the relationship between climate change and the frequency, intensity, and destruction of wildfires? What role does forestry management play in these wildfires? How should forestry management change in light of the reality of climate change? Our panel today discussing these issues is George Perry, professor in the School of Environment at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. He has authored several articles, including co-author of Green Fire Breaks as a Management Tool for Wildfires, Lessons from China. Peter Ward is professor of biology and professor of Earth and Space Sciences at the University of Washington, Seattle. He is the co-author of the best-selling Rare Earth: Why Complex Life is Uncommon in the Universe, and the author of many books including Under a Green Sky, Global Warming, The Mass Extinction of the Past, and What They Can Tell Us About Our Future, and The Medea Hypothesis: Is Life on Earth Ultimately Self-Destructive?, which was listed by the New York Times as one of the 100 most important ideas of 2009. Beverly Law is emeritus professor and was previously professor of global change biology and terrestrial systems science in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society at Oregon State University. She is an American Geophysical Union Fellow, an Aldo Leopold Fellow, and the author of over 200 articles and chapters, including Drivers of Future Ecosystem Change in the U.S. Pacific Northwest, the Role of Climate, Fire, and Nitrogen. And William Moomaw, emeritus professor of international environmental policy and the founding director of the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy at the Fletcher School. He has been a lead author of 5 intergovernmental panels on climate science, the IPCC reports. He is also author of Scientists, Diplomats, or Diplomat Scientists: Who Makes Science Diplomacy Effective? So, I will start with George. What ultimately has been the cause of these fires, and specifically, what has been the impact of global phenomena such as climate change on the intensity and the frequency of these fires?
All right, kia ora from New Zealand. The way I would think about it is that, as we learn at primary school, fire is a triangle. So there's oxygen, there's fuel, and there's ignition. And all of those are changing at the moment quite rapidly. So climate has an integral role to play in that, because both long-term climate is changing, but also an important part of climate change is increasing prevalence of extreme events. So, for example, drought events, heavy rainfall events at times that don't normally happen. And it's those extreme events are really crucial because they are driving things like lengthening fire season. So in Australia, the fire season last year started 3 or 4 months earlier than it has in the past. It's very difficult, though, to attribute individual fire events just to say this is because of climate change. Climate change provides a context for shifts in the fire regime. So as ecologists, we're really interested in long-term patterns of fire. How often does it occur? When does it occur? Where does it occur? How intense is it? Because that's both what plant and animals are being selected for. That's the evolutionary driver of response to fire. And because in the long term, that'll determine resilience of the ecosystems and humans. So climate is important, but alongside that, there are important shifts in human land use practices. In the African continent, for example, fire occurrence is actually declining. And that's to do with shifts in agricultural land use practices, urbanizing populations and so forth. And so that's clearly quite important. In some parts of the world, so where I am in New Zealand, 99.9% of fires are caused by humans. Before people were here, there was effectively very little fire. So all of these things are changing simultaneously. And I think, a narrative where we just say it's all climate change or it's all forest management or it's all peri-urban expansion isn't really very helpful. The challenge is to try and disentangle them all because they affect each other. There are feedbacks at play. We're very aware that if we just naively manipulate one part of the system, we can get these perverse outcomes, despite our best efforts. I think there's others on the panel who are much better equipped than me to talk about exactly what's going on in the Pacific Northwest, in the west of the US. But I think we can expect to see more of these events. We saw them last austral summer in Australia. So I think we are going to see them more and more into the future in the parts of the world that are fire prone.
Peter Ward, you are in Seattle, so in the heart of many of this, and I know your work focuses on the way in which human life or life on the planet can be destructive. How much of this is driven by relatively sort of normal, natural ways in which we interact with our environment? And what does this say about the nature of human interactions with the environment?
Yeah, well, that's the most important question, isn't it? We talk about climate change, and the president asterisk of the United States says that there isn't any climate change or no scientific consensus for it. But what's causing climate change? There's a very simple answer. It's human overpopulation. Why are we having so many fires in California and the Northwest and all over? Is that more and more of us now are moving into the forest zones. We are moving our houses into places where there were very few humans before because there are so many humans. And we all want to have that beautiful forest experience. In Seattle, it's just a single city now, from Olympia all the way up to the border. And the forest regions are now infiltrated with houses. So why do we have so much carbon dioxide? Too many people.
Beverly, you're also being in the Northwest, up in Oregon, a lot of your research is focused on issues like, forestry management and the relationship with the forest itself. Is there a way that we can manage the human interactions with the environment that might mitigate some of these effects?
First, let me give you a little bit of information about this. The burn area has increased over the past 30 years. But it's mostly in the dry areas that are already dry, but this is, it's just going to be worse with climate change. What we've learned in the Northwest is there's patchwork in the Coast Range and up in the Cascades, and young forests burn hotter, they're closer to the ground, they have thin bark, their branches come to the ground. So when you have these young patches of forests that are interspersed with the older forests, then it makes the older forests more vulnerable. And so what is often put forward as a solution is to thin the forests, but that doesn't stop fire occurrence and it doesn't change the fire trends. We know that. So there are other things that we can do that are more important, and that's to protect the communities. The communities that are already in fire-prone regions, such as southwestern Oregon, and that's to help them put a protected area or what called defensible space around their homes, and then to harden their homes by using siding and roofing and watering the roof. Those are things that have worked in some of those other burn areas. When it comes to managing the forests, when we think about in terms of carbon, the carbon is better in the forest, and if you thin, you end up having to come back and thin, and then you're already putting a lot of it into the atmosphere. One of the things we found over the past 115 years in Oregon, 65% of the wood that's been harvested in that time frame is already back in the atmosphere. It's already been emitted to the atmosphere. 19% is in landfills and only 16% is in long-term wood products. So that's not a good way to try and mitigate climate change. We did a study on mitigating climate change over Oregon, and the one approach that ended up improving the conditions, increasing forest stocks, reducing emissions, was to preserve about half of the federal lands and call it like forest carbon preserves. And then the next thing was to double the harvest cycles back to where they were. These forests can live to 800 years old. And the reason that they haven't died yet, well, is that they haven't had something kill them yet. So these forests can store it for hundreds of years. They can store it in live and dead carbon for hundreds of years because it takes hundreds of years to build it up and hundreds of years for it to decompose. So when we look at climate change, we're really better off to try and mitigate by protecting the forests from communities, like stop building these communities right next to forest area, And then for those who are already there, help them protect their homes. And then to do more to try and keep carbon in the forest and not put it in the atmosphere, because that's a contributing factor and that makes the problem worse.
Now, Bill Moomaw, as a climate scientist who is actively engaged in the political community, particularly the work you're doing with the IPCC, how much are these fires creating narratives about the need to mitigate climate change and to address climate change, kind of raising the stakes for not addressing climate change? And the way in which the debate tends to be framed is this about climate change? Is this about the best way to manage the forest, about population, et cetera?
I'm actually a physical chemist by training, and spent the first half of my career doing laboratory science, and in 1988 shifted over to applying that science to climate change and the solutions to climate change. And when I first started, the discussion was basically sometime in the far distant future, around 2100, we'd see climate change. Well, the climate has changed. The world average temperature is about 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was in pre-industrial times. And in the Arctic, in places, it's 5 and 6 degrees warmer. And that has changed the whole dynamics of the atmosphere. The reason that we get these incredible hot spells, and then look at the whipsaw in Denver. They had whatever it was, 100-degree temperature one day, and 3 days later they had snow, 6 or 12 inches of snow. The reason that's happening is because we've disrupted something called the Arctic vortex, which is a wind that circulates around the Arctic and keeps the cold air there. Well, that's been disrupted, so that air can spill out at any time and go far south to Denver and make it cold. We've also disrupted the jet stream and made it more stagnant so that you get these long drought periods in one place. And while the Northwest is burning and the West is burning, here in the Northeast, we have hardly had days over 80 degrees. It's been dry, though. It has not been raining. On the other hand, the Gulf Coast is seeing tropical storm after tropical storm intensifying in 24 hours beyond anything we've ever seen before. And then to put I don't know whether I'm going to call this the icing on the cake, is by putting the icing on the ice. Ohio State scientists the other day reported that it looks like maybe the Greenland ice sheet is beyond redemption. It may not be stoppable. And that means 21 feet of sea level rise over the whole world, all right? So why are we doing this to ourselves? Back in November, 4 colleagues and I published a paper called World Scientists Warning of a Climate Emergency. And when we published it on November 5th, which by the way was one day after the president sent the documents to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, which was wonderful timing for our paper because it meant it got a lot of attention. It wasn't though he did that and then we wrote the paper. No, it had been in the works for months, obviously. And when we published it, we had just over 11,000 scientists from 153 countries sign on and agree with what we had said in that article. We showed 29 metrics of what is causing climate change and the consequences of climate change. And these are all different from anything that we have ever encountered before. And I've worked mostly on the mitigation side. Most of the IPCC work I did dealt with technological solutions, a bit about land use change, but in the last 10 years, I've shifted from, will solar panels make it or not, to which they have. They're now cheaper than operating an existing coal plant to install new solar panels with batteries now in many parts of the world, including the US and India. So why do we keep on opening more more coal plants, digging more coal? Australia is digging, wants to destroy parts of the Great Barrier Reef in order to have big ships come in and take more coal out. One of the largest coal regions in the world is being considered right now. So why do we keep doing this when it's not just the fires in the West? I mean, for people in the West, that's their metric. For the people in the Gulf Coast, it's intensified numerous hurricanes. For people all over the world, 130 degrees in Death Valley. Well, it was 127 degrees in India earlier. This is a global phenomenon. So the urgency is greater than ever, and yet our aspirations are minimal. The Paris Agreement on Climate wants to hold the limit to about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit rise. We're already at 2. And we should make every effort to keep it down to about 2.7 degrees. We're already at 2. What we have is a goal that will make it worse. If we keep it to that, it will not get worse than that. But we are headed to not just 3.5, but 5, maybe 6 degrees Fahrenheit. I can't imagine how the world will be like under those circumstances. So on the other hand, the optimistic note is that we have the technologies to phase out fossil fuels in the next couple of decades. We have the forest capacity that if we let it keep growing, it will store vast amounts of carbon. Colleagues of mine at the Woodwell Climate Research Center demonstrated that if we let all secondary forests, those that have already been cut once, regrow and stop converting the land from forest to agriculture and urban areas, that we almost close the gap between what we are putting in and what nature is taking out. So if we can stop doing foolish things that cause our forests to burn and stop doing foolish things that keep 19th century fuels in 20th century technologies in place instead of 21st century technologies, we have a chance. But if we don't do that, well, Peter mentioned population. Well, this seems to be one way that the population might be taken care of, and it's not a pretty picture at all. It means immense human suffering. So we have the tools, we have the options, we have the understanding, but we keep doing things like making forest fires worse by the way we manage forests, of bailing out fossil fuel industries and building more gas pipelines and everything, rather than shifting that money to do other things. So if we can get on the right path, I think we have a chance. If we stay on the path we're on, I don't know, maybe the metaphor is we're burnt toast. I mean, that's probably the best I can come up with.
Peter Ward, you had highlighted this issue of population, and I would probably add, there's the overpopulation question. There's also general questions about land use where we're moving into forests. How much of this is just the sheer number of population? How much of it is, resource depletion reasons why we're moving in, or economic factors like the need for cheaper land, for housing and the ways in which cities are growing without any sort of a check? What are the different ways population is having these negative effects?
Well, I mean, you have people here that know forest and how we're moving into the forest so much better than I do. I'm really more of a deep time person, but going back to Greenland and the other aspect are an enormous, I've been to Antarctica 4 times. I've worked on the peninsula and seen the reduction of glaciers there. But I wrote a book in 2010, which did horribly, called Our Flooded Earth. And at that time, I tried to say that of all the climate change aspects facing us, sea level rise is the most deleterious for human populations. If you look at how much of our food comes from sea level, especially in Asia with the rice fields, and the salt goes sideways a whole lot better than it goes straight up. And so if we lost Greenland, not even losing Greenland, but losing the tiniest bits of Greenland that we're losing, a meter sea level rise by 2100 is the minimum we can expect. But what if it's 2? And the other aspects that scare me, if you look at the estimates for 2300, we're talking 5 to 10 meters. How much human food is lost because of this? And so this, to me, sea level rise is the single greatest threat to us, I think, in terms of human population numbers, of danger that climate change is doing. The forests are burning all right, but the oceans are rising.
And George Perry, being on an island in New Zealand, and as well as a reminder that this is not just about Western fires, but it wasn't terribly long ago where the most important environmental issue were the fires in Australia. How much is this just a factor we're going to have to learn to live with? Or are there ways we can mitigate these factors where we can limit the number of times we have to battle these fires?
Peter's just mentioned sea level rise, and we're already seeing in the South Pacific climate refugees that we have reached the point where there are serious discussions about whose moral duty is it to house people whose country effectively disappears under the ocean. So that's going on down here. That is the reality for many communities across the South Pacific. It's happening in Australia, where there's internal movement towards places like Tasmania from New South Wales and West Australia. So I think we are going to have to deal with these facts. There doesn't seem to be the will, for whatever reason, really to mitigate climate in an effective way. I think the other thing that's really important to think about when we look at population trends is that it's not just that we've got more people, but there's been a massive increase in affluence across the planet. And we know that that's really correlated, for example, with calorie demand. So as affluence increases, we see very strong dietary shifts towards much more eating meat, for example, and away from vegetarian plant-based diets. And we know that sort of food production is really important for climate change and so forth. So I think it's easy to say, even if we stabilise population growth, which is the most optimistic UN projection, if affluence is increasing and the demand for the things that come with affluence, then we're still going to be stuck in the same problem. So it's not as simple as just the number of people. It's really to do with human behaviour. And of course, those are difficult issues. We need to be aware that we have colonised much of the world, and it's a difficult argument to say, well, you can't have the privileges that we did. And those things are going on in many parts of the world at the moment. In terms of the fires, well, I think what's interesting is that a lot of the places where we are seeing these large fires have experienced fires in the past. It's not like we haven't seen them before, but they're happening in different ways. They're happening at different times. They're happening in different intensities. They're burning vegetation that we've never seen burned before. So in Tasmania, where I've worked a lot, there were huge fires in 2016, and they were triggered by a climate event that we just hadn't seen before, which was extremely high frequency dry lightning storms, which is something that doesn't happen in Tasmania. And the outcome of that was soils that had formed since the last glacial, that were probably 18,000 years old, burned to bedrock. And so what we're seeing is effectively the loss of the memory in these systems. We're losing the capacity for the system to respond. We're losing the resilience from the system, would be the trendy word. So I think one of the challenges we face is we have to make some decisions about what we want to protect. And it probably isn't a very useful idea to say we want to go back to a fire regime or an environment that was what Columbus found when he got to the Americas, or what the first Europeans or Polynesians found when they got to New Zealand. We have to accept that there probably are some ecosystems that we're going to lose. And we have to think hard about our priorities. So what are we trying to protect? Is it functioning ecosystems that provide the services that humans need? Or is it sort of locking up sort of museum type forests to try and preserve things from the past? And those are really questions both for scientists and society to think about what they want out of their landscapes. I don't really see scientists' role as to tell people what forests we should have. We can perhaps help people think about how they could get to those conditions that they want, what the consequences of failing to do certain things are, as Bill and Peter have said, but it really needs a broader dialogue across all of society to work some of these things out.
Yes, Beverly, sort of, related to that, since some of this talk is about what areas should we protect, and, if we're not able, obviously, to protect all the forested areas, what's the best way to think about the relationship with, with our forests, with these pressures that have been described?
So what we have done is we did just that kind of analysis in the near future and up to year 2100. But first, we had to lay a lot of groundwork and figure out where are the forests most vulnerable to fire and drought in the future. And then we ranked them by their vulnerability. And then we chose areas that had low vulnerability to both of those under future climate conditions. And we said, those are the areas you want to protect. Now that would be like the coastal Oregon and coastal Washington forests. And we didn't do up into Alaska, but it's probably up through BC into Alaska. So those are really high biomass, high carbon density forests that have low vulnerability, have very deep soils, spongy soil surface. It's not to say things aren't going to get even worse there, but they're the best places to try and protect them. If you have to try and figure out where to set aside lands, it would be in those kinds of systems. And so that can be done. Those kinds of spatial and temporal analyses can be done to at least help better inform instead of just taking a wild hack at things and trying to figure out what to do.
When we come back, how can climate mitigation and adaptation complicate forest management? Stay with us. You are listening to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. The western United States is ablaze with intense and widespread fires. What role does climate change, forest management, overpopulation, and resource management play in the increasingly devastated fire seasons worldwide? Doug Becker explores.
Bill Moomaw, there's been this fairly intense debate, the community addressing climate change about adaptation versus mitigation. I remember during one of the Democratic primary debates, then candidate Andrew Yang had suggested that we've spent so much time talking about mitigation, but climate change is already here, and we need to start addressing those concerns. And then he was rebuked by saying that sounds defeatist as far as dealing with the questions of mitigation. I guess broadly, mitigation versus adaptation, where should we really focus our attempts? And then in particular, is the best way to address this to try to address climate change and try to decrease temperatures? Or is it to think about, okay, which forests, as Beverly just highlighted, which areas of the forest should we try to protect, and which areas do we say it's going to be extremely difficult?
I recall, again, back when I started working on this, I think most scientists felt that to talk about adaptation was a sign of giving up. John Holden, who was President Barack Obama's science advisor for 8 years, the longest serving science advisor in history, once put it this way. When it comes to climate change, there's mitigation, there's adaptation, and there's suffering. Those are our three choices. And we're already, unfortunately, because we've failed to do enough mitigation, we are in a situation where we are already adapting. We are adapting in all sorts of ways. I mean, there are people in Florida, and I know a person who is a technically savvy person who just built his retirement home on a low sea island off of South Carolina, but he built it up on stilts. Okay, so when the waves come crashing through, they'll go underneath the house. I told him he was nuts, but you know, he said I know there's going to be sea level rise. I know we're going to suffer that, but I mean, hey, I'm only here for this many more years, so that's fine. But I think if you look at it economically, we have a certain amount of money we can spend, and which do we spend it on? Do we spend it on mitigation, or do we spend it on adaptation? Every dollar we do not spend on mitigation means we have to spend probably $3 on adaptation. I don't know where the break point is. I don't know where it comes out that it's more worthwhile economically to spend it on adaptation than on mitigation. Because of the kind of the way human minds work, we are short-term thinkers, not long-term thinkers. And so if there's an immediate threat, we want to adapt now. Actually, one of Beverly's colleagues and I, Bill Ripple, have been asked by there's an international global center on adaptation that was formed a couple of years ago that is being co-chaired by Bill Gates and the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And they published a report last year on adaptation. And they make it clear that we have to do both. But they also make it clear that because we have failed to do enough mitigation, we have to do a lot of adaptation. One of the hardest things to do, though, is to get people to recognize that one adaptation is you can't live anywhere you want. Or at least you can't live anywhere you want and expect society to bail you out. That the Forest Service will spend whatever it is, Bev, is it $5 billion this year or something like that, some incredible amount, 2.5, 3, 5, whatever it is, a big number, fighting fires that are made worse because of decisions made by local planning boards. Right. I mean, so we have a structure in society and our political structure, which is pretty dysfunctional for the task at hand. One of the things that Bill Ripple and I are doing is putting together an analysis where we try to look at actions that can be taken that are both adaptive, that create resilience, and also contribute to mitigation. And forests are one area where that works really well. There are a lot of things we can be doing with forests that will make them more resilient. That means we are adapting by not doing what we have been doing. We're doing something different. And at the same time, those actions mitigate climate change by making the forest less vulnerable to fires, more likely to grow successfully and store more carbon. You know, there's a lot of talk now. There's the trillion tree. You probably heard about this. We're going to plant 1 trillion trees, and that'll suck up everything. Well, what is 1 trillion trees? Oh, it's kind of Australia, right? Planted in trees, or maybe more. Maybe it's Australia and India combined. Anyway, it's a lot of trees. I'm sorry, but those trees, even if we successfully planted them, and if they all lived, and Bev can tell us more about how likely that is, would not store very much carbon in the next 2 or 3 decades when we absolutely have to have it. However, existing trees that are already growing will store vast amounts of carbon as they continue growing. And so that suggests right there what Bev mentioned, which was having carbon reserves. And we have a scientific way of assessing which forests should be managed that way. Basically, come back to your original question. If we don't keep mitigating, we can never do enough adaptation at some point. And so we have to keep mitigating, but we also need to be adapting. But if we can find strategies that help us do both simultaneously, let's do those first.
Peter Ward, Bill just said, got us thinking about long-term versus short-term. And this, obviously, the nature of your research and your writing is much more long-term, thinking about the long sweep of human interactions with the environment. What would you sort of initially propose as first of all, a way to start thinking about longer-term trends and maybe a shift in the way in which we as humans interact with the environment that would be more stable in more of a long-term scenario?
Well, if you put your geological hat on, if you really want to think long-term, what does a deep root do compared to a shallow root? So one of the interesting moments in Earth history was the Devonian, started 400-something million years ago. The very first forests crept over the Earth. The consequence of those first forests was the longest ice age in geological history. 50 million years of glaciers, simply because we got deep roots, went down. And what roots do, they break up bedrock. When you expose bedrock to atmosphere, you start a cycle that removes CO2. You produce clays and you are sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. When we burn a forest down, we stop doing that. And I was really interested in asking my colleagues, in a large forest burn, how much CO2 is pushed up into the atmosphere? And then secondly, when that forest is gone, what is the consequence of no longer having that deep carbon dioxide reduction mechanism that deep roots do? The carbon silicate feedback system has kept this planet at equable temperature. We can have water on it for 3.5 billion years. That cycle is affected when a forest goes away. what are we doing? What does it cost when a forest burns down? Because you're having less oxygen, you have less CO2 being pulled out of the atmosphere, and you've got all those roots which are no longer there. So it's an enormous geochemical problem. I'm just curious about the calculations of the size. If we have 1 million acres that are burned in the West Coast, how much carbon has that put up into the atmosphere in that one forest burn versus how much less CO2 will be sucked out of the atmosphere? And I don't know if people are doing those calculations, taking both the under the root as well as what's going up in the atmosphere point of view.
So Beverly, if there's someone on the panel who might have done any of those calculations, it's likely you. So I guess I can ask you if you have those calculations. And then also, Bill had raised the issue about the 1 trillion tree proposal that, if I recall, was at the State of the Union address the president had outlined. I mean, how realistic is that proposal? I know when I've taught classes, I always like to ask the students, if you plant 1 tree a second, how long will it take you to plant 1 trillion trees? And the short answer is, what, 32,000 years. And so, you know, obviously that number doesn't seem realistic. I jokingly say I wish he had said 1 bajillion, because that kind of is the same meaning. But how much is replanting trees, these carbon offset forests that have been used as an address for climate change, a potential approach? And then also, I don't know if you have any thoughts on Peter's question about the amount of carbon that the fires have actually released into the atmosphere.
I can think about it in terms of percentages. So of the biomass that's there, only about less than 20% combusts. But trees are taking up about 30% of what we're emitting in the atmosphere. So there's a net loss there. So that's pretty easy back of the envelope, but I mean, it took a lot more to get those percentage numbers. Trillion trees, that to me is kind of a red herring, in that what it means, what would likely happen, at least in the US, was that a lot of forest would be cut to plant those 1 million trees. And so, so that means, you know, zero net gain. So, you know, we have to think of really forests as being the existing ones, as keeping it in the forest because it took so long to get there. And it's a carbon bank. And so you're better off keep protecting that carbon bank, because once you start hacking at it, a lot of it goes back to the atmosphere fairly quickly. I don't know how they decided on the number of trees. We've done these different ways of analyzing this, from what's the photosynthetic potential of the surface of the earth and all that. When we do our analyses, we examine what is the soil depth and soil fertility, and can it support trees? Is there enough water to support trees? When I've heard ridiculous things of populating the Sudan, or, you know, the Chad, the large desert areas, you know, it takes cooler climate to begin with, and it takes being able to access water. It's just not a feasible thing. That's why I say it's a low-hanging fruit of protecting what you already have. It's not that all of those forests are going to survive in the future, but we have a pretty good handle on which ones might.
George Perry, first of all, any thoughts that you have about these proposals? You know, certainly would be, please.
I had a couple of answers. The first was I was actually involved in a project that directly estimated carbon emissions from fires in Russia. So we looked at the 2001, so it's quite old work, fire season in Russia, where there was about 40,000 square kilometres burned. And we estimated direct carbon emissions of 40 to 55 megatons, which in that year equated to 10 to 15% of Russia's industrial emissions. So it's a lot of carbon. And I think the thing is that when we burn biomass, we don't just release carbon. We're volatilizing nitrogen, and all sorts of other fluxes are going into the atmosphere that almost certainly have important climate change implications. So I think, you know, you can't think about increased atmospheric carbon without thinking about human nitrification, those other things that we're doing to the Earth's biogeochemical systems, because they interact with each other. So, you know, maybe if there's more nitrogen, there's now at least double the amount of nitrogen in the Earth system there was at the start of the Industrial Revolution. Is that going to mean that plants grow faster and suck up more carbon? The evidence that people have found is that that probably doesn't happen in some systems, but it might in others. It's pretty complicated. In terms of 1 trillion trees, we had a similar thing here in New Zealand. We're a bit less ambitious, so we've gone for 1 billion. I think there's some pretty tricky issues. First, as Beverly says, we might just chop down forests to build new ones. We might build very high yield, high rotation forests for timber, but what's going to happen when we chop them down? I think there's some pretty important questions about whose land is it. Are we just going to plant these trees on? Are we just going to roam around and commandeer land to plant trees? My grassland ecology colleagues talk about the tyranny of the trees. There's large parts of the world that aren't naturally treed systems. Perhaps we could be thinking about looking after our grasslands better, preserving the vast wealth of soil carbon that we have by modifying agricultural practices. So I think the final point I'd say is that we know that very, very large old trees are sequestering as much carbon in a year as, small trees might in their whole life. And so we need to be looking after these very large old growth forests if we're really wanting to bank carbon. Chopping them down to grow fast-growing eucalyptus or pinus or whatever seems to me a pretty perverse sort of system. In New Zealand, the interesting thing is early successional vegetation, so young trees, are by far the most flammable. So New Zealand could end up in a system where we build a perfect landscape for fire by planting lots of young trees to try and mitigate carbon offsets. In New Zealand, the issue is really much more probably to do with dairying, the intensive use of the land for dairy, methane emissions, and those sorts of things. And so you've got to try and balance these things out. And methane is a very effective greenhouse gas, so perhaps we'd be better off reducing our dairy footprint rather than planting lots of small trees.
Beverly Law, you have a reaction to that?
Oh, well, I just wanted to add something to it. There was a nice study done on the lower 48 of the US, lower 48 states. And it was to give it some context of, protecting carbon versus letting forests burn. So what has happened is that harvest-related emissions over the lower 48 are 8 times those from all natural causes. Insects, fire, wind throw, 8 times. And in Oregon, we were getting 10 times. Harvest-related emissions are 10 times fire emissions. So that gives you some context of where is the carbon going from forests and how can you alter what we're doing to reduce the amount that we're putting in the atmosphere from forests.
You're listening to Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. Our topic today, the multiple factors that contribute to the increased intensity and destruction of fire seasons, both in the Western US and around the world. Now, Beverly, of the panelists, you probably were most directly affected by the current fires that are going on. You had told us about the effects it's having directly on your research and your research facilities. Could you share what's happened?
So while I was the head of a research network, the AmeriFlex network, we started with about 20 sites. There are about 500 sites in North America now and maybe 1,000 worldwide. And these are sites where we directly measure carbon dioxide exchanged with the atmosphere, carbon dioxide and water vapor exchange. So we know over a course of a year and many years, what is the net that's gone into the ecosystems and come out. And so I've been running Ponderosa Pine site that's in the semi-arid region. It's about 90-year-old forest for about 20 years and having these continuous measurements for 20 years. It's wired, everything's wired. Well, a fire came through 2 weeks ago and destroyed most of our ground equipment and the tower that's about 90 feet tall. So we'll have to replace all that, but we still have some instruments running and we had instruments running right up until the fire. So we've written a grant to be able to follow the recovery from fire and see what species make it, what doesn't. There's a relic species there, incense cedar, that really belongs north of us. Will that come back? And then there are other issues that happen when you have a sandy soil in a semi-arid region. It takes a long time for natural regeneration to occur, and that's a primary form of regeneration there. So you could have a lot of shrubland for a while, but we'll follow it. The nice thing is we had a lot of drought years and then really good years in that 20-something years of measurements to compare with, so we can look at the trajectory of change. And that's nature, that happened. That was a lightning strike that happened north of our tower.
Such a great scientific approach, kind of the scientific version of trying to make a lemonade out of lemons, I suppose. Yeah. Now, Bill Moomaw, one of the challenges I think that climate scientists engaged in climate diplomacy have is how closely should you draw climate change as a cause of these fires as a way to highlight and to emphasize the need for climate action versus the scientific, realization that there's numerous factors that go into each wildfire, including frequently human activity that might be responsible, sometimes at least human activity. I know here in Southern California, gender reveal parties have certainly become a part of the conversation because of humans, causing fires. So the scientists in you must be wary of monocausal explanations like climate change causes these fires, but the climate diplomat in you must think, well, this is at least an opportunity that we've got people's attention. How do you manage those two factors?
When I first got into working on climate change and something would happen, I'd invariably, like many people who are climate scientists, would get a phone call from the press. So did climate change cause that fire? Did climate change cause that storm? Did it cause that tornado? Did it do that? And I took the coward's way out, which most scientists did at that time, which is to say, well, no single event can be attributed to climate change. I realized that is actually the wrong question and the wrong answer. Even if the question were right, it was the wrong answer. Because let's just take fires, since that's the topic here. The condition to have a fire, you have to have several things happen at once. You need to have the right conditions for it. You need to have an event. You have to have enough fuel, obviously, in the forest, and you have to have an ignition event. Fireworks at a gender reveal party turns out to be just one of many foolish and stupid things that human beings do to ignite these. But nature also ignites them. Bev mentioned dry lightning fires. That normally we don't get lightning when it's in dry weather events, but in these very strange, different events, we do. Those may be a result of a changed climate. In other words, if we have a changed climate, it means we have either, in this case, less precipitation, therefore higher temperatures. So that means things would dry out and be more vulnerable to an ignition event. But then we've also done deliberate things like thinning the forests. And as you just heard, from New Zealand, and it's not just true in New Zealand, it's true in California and Oregon and Australia and every place else in the world. If you have a lot of small little trees, they burn more readily than big trees. Big trees have a lot more water stored in them. They have thicker bark. Anyone who's been a Boy Scout or a Girl Scout knows that it's harder to make a fire out of big logs than it is out of little dry sticks. And that's the case with forests. So we have actually set things up to make the changes that are in our changed climate, the alterations in our changed climate. They set up the conditions. We make it worse by our management, and then we are often responsible for the ignition. But sometimes climate change is responsible for the ignition, as with this dry lightning. So to say it's caused by, it's really not that. It's that the climate conditions have basically set the conditions for more fires. Whether if there were no spark, there'd be no fire, and whether that spark is natural or us, that depends on the specific fire.
So, George Perry, I know you've done quite a bit of work on issues management tools with wildfires. a specific tool we should be focusing more on than we currently have been as far as trying to manage the outbreaks of these fires?
I don't know if there's a specific tool. I think one thing we do know now is that under the right conditions, anything will burn. So this idea that there are sort of forests that are immune to fire simply because they're too wet or too large or whatever isn't the case. That under extreme climatic conditions, basically anything will burn. We've been involved in various things trying to work out ways. So there's been quite a big debate in the literature whether fire fighting, especially in the US, is a classic example of a military-industrial complex, where investing so much in fire effectively means that you have to charge around with jumbo jets and fight fire, and you're stuck in this sort of trap like that. Now, that's not really the case in New Zealand. It possibly is in Australia to some extent. So there's some really interesting work about what people have called the sociopathology of fire, drawing on work in North America and the US, North America and Australia. I mean, we've been working on tools. I mean, I have to sort of put my cards on the table. The average fire size in New Zealand is 4 hectares. So it's not like a place where large fires are rampaging through the landscape. But because fire has because before people were in New Zealand, there was very limited fire activity simply because there wasn't any lightning. The vegetation isn't very well adapted to deal with fire at all. We don't have any of the classic traits. So fire is extremely destructive in New Zealand. It's just a very different context. So we've been looking at things like green fire breaks. So ways that you might be able to, instead of using bulldozers to build traditional fire breaks, could we identify indigenous plant species that have other ecosystem service values, perhaps provide fruit for birds or whatever, and use them as strips in the landscape. There's some work on that in parts of the States, I believe, but in China and Korea, there's a huge emphasis on that. So we're sort of trying to think about ways that you might be able to maximize multiple benefits in the landscape. So if you're doing that, could you maximize protection against fire, habitat for the avifauna, a little bit of carbon? That's not always going to work particularly well. There are other issues associated with it. It might be expensive in terms of weed invasion. It's probably a good solution because one of the things, and I was reading the New York Times this morning, that Oregon is about to experience landslides after the fires. It's a good way for rehabilitating land in that sense. So yeah, I think you have to be pluralistic. It's not like there is a single solution to the fire problem and it's green fire breaks or it's aerial bombardment. There's a whole range of different things that we need to think about. I think we also need to be aware that there are lots of lags in the system, that when we have large fire events, potentially the ecosystem could take centuries to respond. And that even if we stopped fire now, there will be lags in the system. Environmental systems are large, they're slow, they respond over a very long time period. So a good example might be, for example, in the Great Lakes, where there's a big problem with phosphorus and nitrogen loading, that's expected to continue for centuries. Even if we took the pressure out of the system, there's this legacy fossil phosphorus problem. And so when we're thinking about mitigation, adaptation, dealing with these events, we do have to adopt an appropriate timescale. They're not, it's not going to be fixed in 6 months or a year. And I think just a one-size-fits-all solution probably isn't a good approach. So, I mean, a classic example of that's fire suppression. So in some systems, it's been completely devastating. So fire suppression in, say, longleaf pine forests, where the fire return interval is decadal or subdecadal, is problematic. Fire suppression of forests in North America, where fire return intervals are, say, 500 years, is completely different, because fire suppression hasn't even been going the expected fire interval. So simply to say fire suppression is bad, we can't do it, or prescribed fire is good, we must do it, I think is quite problematic. We need to think about the places we're working in a bit more, probably, and that fire is very different in different places.
So it seems that the lessons that we should take from today, first of all, is the need for a pluralistic approach, a recognition that there's multiple causes to fires, but certainly conditions that climate change, that the population moving into forested areas, the lack of management of not just of the sort of the forest broadly, but the lack of management of the human interactions within the forest, including things like construction and the spread of cities, that we need a multi-pronged approach addressing a number of different areas, and most importantly, a longer term view on these issues than just how do we get through the next fire season. And so I guess a part of me says, if I take anything from this, it's time to roll up our sleeves and to start doing what needs to be done to try to address these issues, because fires are not going away. Thank you very much. Our panel today has been George Perry, professor in the School of Environment at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. He is the author of several articles, including Green Fire Breaks as a Management Tool for Wildfires, Lessons from China. Peter Ward is professor of biology and professor of spatial sciences at the University of Washington, Seattle. He's the co-author of many books, including Rare Earth, Why Complex is Uncommon in the Universe, and Under a Green Sky, Global Warming, the Mass Extinctions of the Past, and What Can They Tell Us About Our Future. Beverly Law, who is Emeritus Professor and previously Professor of Global Change Biology and Terrestrial Systems Science in the Department of Forest, Ecosystems, and Society at Oregon State University. She is an American Geophysical Union Fellow, an Aldo Leopold Fellow, and author of over 200 articles and chapters, including Drivers of Future Ecosystem Change in the U.S. Pacific Northwest, the Role of Climate, Fire, and Nitrogen. And William Moomaw, Emeritus Professor of International Environmental Policy and the founding director of the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy at the Fletcher School. He's been the lead author of 5 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports and the author of Scientist Diplomats, or Diplomat Scientists, Who Makes Science Diplomacy Effective. Thank you all very much for your time and for your insights.
And that's it for today's show. Thank you to all of our guests and to those who make this program possible. To Sub Dongre, our webmaster, Ankine Arasian, Melissa Chiprin, Mike Hurst, and Tim Page. Most of all, thank you for listening. If you missed part of the show, you can check out our archives at scholarcircle.org, kpfk.org, and please like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at @Armoodian, and we'll see you next week.